Now let's talk about word choice. It's important to be careful with word choice. Here are some examples of why that's important. It's not correct to say the rainfall affected the fluorescence intensity of all components. You should say the rainfall affected the fluorescence intensity of all components. Effect and affect are two words that are commonly confused. So look for other commonly confused words and make sure that you're choosing the correct word. The second example is an example of an ambiguous word choice. Pepper capsicum species has a cosmopolitan distribution and considerable economic importance. Now, technically, cosmopolitan is not wrong, but cosmopolitan is a word that has a lot of different meanings. And in the United States, cosmopolitan is typically used to mean something associated with cities or culture, worldliness. Someone who travels the world is considered to be cosmopolitan. Somebody that likes to go to Paris and London and Tokyo and fancy cities like that, we refer to them as a cosmopolitan person. Using that word to describe a plant, although it's correct because one of the meanings of cosmopolitan is distributed worldwide, it's correct, but it's ambiguous because of all of the other meanings of cosmopolitan. So I would suggest that the authors just say pepper has a worldwide distribution, and that would not be confusing to readers because it's a lot more direct. So some other examples of word choice are where the meaning is just not quite right. It's a little bit different than confused terms like affect and effect, but when the meaning is just not quite right. So this example says, this result suggests that the river acted as a geographic barrier that avoids gene flow between populations in the east. So avoid is not quite the right word here. We should use the word prevents. So the difference between prevent and avoid has to do with the agent and the intention. So make sure that you're choosing words that have the correct meaning in that context. A few more examples here. 7 genes representing transcriptional regulators. It would be better to say 7 genes encoding transcriptional regulators. That's more precise. The next example, many studies are conducted based on a drug repurposing strategy to rapidly identify an effective drug from existing ones. Well, the studies are not based on this strategy, they're using the strategy. You would only say they're based on the strategy if the researchers doing these studies took the original strategy and modified it to make a different strategy. That's not what this sentence says. It would be better to say many studies are conducted using a drug repurposing strategy. Another word choice that you're going to be faced with is using the word that or the word which. And sometimes it's hard to know which of those two words is the correct one. So I'm going to give you some tips for figuring this out. Now note that these tips are for American style English. The British style English is a little bit different. They tend to use which all the time in the situation that the American style English would choose the word that. So what are these guidelines? That should be used with a restrictive or defining clause. So that is a clause that gives essential information. Which should be used with non-defining clauses that provide additional information, but this additional information is non-essential. And also you need to use a comma before which. Those are a couple of different ways to figure it out. Let's look at some examples. So in the first sentence, this is not the correct word choice. It says low water availability decreases flower production that negatively impacts the resources provided by the plants to the bees. So what you can do is look at the sentence without the phrase in question and see if it makes sense. So if we just said low water availability decreases flower production, that makes sense. That's a complete sentence with a complete thought. So that phrase that follows is a non-defining clause. And remember, the non-defining clauses use the word which. Here's a second example. This sentence says, the global carbon cycle fuels the processes which are responsible for maintaining the ecological functioning of ecosystems. Now, if we read that sentence without the phrase, it just says, the global carbon cycle fuels the processes. Now, that's not a complete thought because we don't know what processes they're talking about. So it is a defining clause that follows. So it should say the global carbon cycle fuels the processes that are responsible for maintaining the ecological functioning of ecosystems. Two more examples coming up for you. We applied a zero-inflated negative binomial regression analysis that is used for count data that exhibit over-dispersion and an excess of zeros. So we shouldn't start the second clause with that because this clause is providing additional information about the binomial regression, but it's not essential information. If the sentence just said we applied a zero-inflated negative binomial regression analysis, that would be a complete sentence with a complete thought. So we're adding additional but non-essential information. Now notice there's a second that in this sentence, and the second one is the correct way to do it. Another example, the way we should not use which is these markers allowed us to compare genetic diversity of populations which have been suggested to be part of the native distribution region. Why is which incorrect? Well, first of all, there's no comma required in front of that phrase. And then also, if you read the sentence up to that point, it's not a complete thought because you don't know which populations. We need additional essential information about those populations. So these are populations that have been suggested to be part of the native distribution region.